Well, we know that the mic is working now. Okay. He loved him as himself. Was it not on before? Okay, sorry. If it was not on, the mic was not on, it was not on, or it was? Then I'll start over for the online people who missed my incredibly... It was on? Okay, okay. Well, then I won't repeat the incredibly inviting introduction that I just gave. Kidding. Okay, so let's start reading again. 1 Samuel 18, 1 through 4. After David had finished talking with Saul, Jonathan became one in spirit with David, and he loved him as himself. From that day, Saul kept David with him and did not let him return home to his family. And Jonathan made a covenant with David because he loved him as himself. Jonathan took off the robe he was wearing and gave it to David, along with his tunic, and even his sword, his bow, and his belt. Now, in the context of the passage that I just read, this is just after David had killed Goliath. Now, if you're raised in a church at all, you know the story of David and Goliath. Goliath was the giant representative of the Philistines, which were a threat to Israel. And the Philistines were, in some ways, bullies against Israel. And they had this guy, Goliath, who, we're not sure exactly how big he was, but they estimate about 9 feet tall. He was about 9 feet tall and just big. Not just lanky, but also big. So that's pretty big, 9-foot tall person. That's almost twice the size of me. And so there's this guy, Goliath, and they were taunting God's nation, Israel. And here David, who was kind of a small guy, he was built, but he was kind of a small guy. He's young as well, not very experienced in battle. David comes, and no one from Israel wanted to challenge Goliath because they were scared, obviously. I would be scared too. And no one wanted to challenge Goliath, and so they were boasting and insulting God's nation. And here comes little David, who comes and defeats Goliath without all the armor that most of them wore. And so this is a huge victory for Israel, huge victory for David. This kind of put David on the map, got King Saul's attention. And so it says, after David had finished talking with Saul, they had a chat. Saul said, congratulations, you defeated the enemy. You're great. You're gonna have a bright future ahead of you. And Jonathan was Saul's son. And so David and Jonathan become friends here. And from this small little passage, we're going to look at 3 goals for developing close friendship. 3 goals for developing close friendship. The first one is intimacy. Number 1 is intimacy. So, in verse 1 it says, after David had finished talking with Saul, Jonathan became one in spirit with David. Jonathan became one in spirit with David, and he loved him as himself. Now, I'm reading from the NIV, but a more literalistic translation would be, the soul of Jonathan was bound to the soul of David. And in some translations it says, the soul of Jonathan was knit to the soul of David. When you knit something, you bind pieces of yarn together, and it becomes a whole. And that's the picture that's given here. It was bound. And soul, the Hebrew language, refers to the inner life of a person. So deep within Jonathan, there was a connection, there was a binding with David in his deep inner self. Now, how many of us can say that our soul is bound to someone else? How many of us can say that? Hopefully, those of us who are married, our souls are bound to our spouse. But apart from that, how many of us have a bound soul to a friend? And it says further that he loved him as himself. Jonathan loved David as himself. As much as he loved himself, which we all do, we all love ourselves, he loved David. Now, this passage is often misinterpreted. There's a mention of two young men, who loved each other deeply. And the misinterpretation is that this was an early example of a same-sex relationship. Let's say David and Jonathan were gay, and it was such a taboo in that culture. They didn't explicitly say it was a same-sex relationship, but that is implied here. There was a romance that was happening. There's that interpretation between David and Jonathan. And I find that really interesting because here's a question. Why can't two men have an intimate relationship with each other? Why can't they love each other so much without having any romantic or sexual connotations? Why can't two men have that without somebody accusing them of having a same-sex relationship or having same-sex attraction? That's the culture that we live in today, where men are forbidden in some ways to feel emotionally close to another man. That's really strange, but that's the culture that we live in, at least in our North American society. There are some societies where men would kiss each other. And some of you guys some of you who are listening in may come from such cultures. You know, I've had men from like the Middle East, for example, kiss me on my cheek, like the first or second time I met them. And at first I was just like, oh, kind of not used to this, having a man's lips on my cheek. But that's the culture. Men are affectionate. But in our culture, that is not the case. And it continues to perpetuate the stereotype of men to be unemotional and stoic and not affectionate. And I don't think that's a biblical stereotype of men. You know, if we look at the person of Jesus, right? Jesus was a person who showed emotion, who was affectionate. When his friend Lazarus died, even though he knew he was going to resurrect him, even though he had the power to resurrect him, he felt the emotions of Mary, Martha, and other family members and friends. He felt that emotion, and in the shortest verse of the Bible, it says, Jesus wept. The manliest man of all men, Jesus Christ, right, who gave himself up for the world and who suffered the torturous death, cried. So we can too. And so it's been ingrained, but intimacy is one thing. It's biblical. Intimacy is something that we can pursue in our friendships. Again, I don't want to leave the women out. And so this is something I think that women innately, at least, have an easier time with. Not all women. This is a generalization. I understand that. But in general, women have an easier time creating intimacy than men do. And so we are focusing on the men, but women also. It is biblical for men to love each other deeply from the heart. A further example of David and Jonathan, later down in chapter 20, 1 Samuel chapter 20, verse 41, it says, after the boy had gone, this is a situation where this is just a few chapters down after this great victory that David had in defeating Goliath. Saul became jealous of David because he was gaining victory, and that shows how insecure Saul was. Saul was getting jealous of David and eventually got to the point where he wanted to kill David, cut him off. That's a very psychopathic way of dealing with with a threat, is to kill him off. And so Jonathan knew about this, and so David and Jonathan are just trying to console each other because David's life was in danger. And they're talking about this and there was a boy who left. After the boy had gone, David got up from the south side of the stone, bowed down before Jonathan 3 times with his face to the ground. And then they kissed each other and wept together, but David wept the most. You know, to be able to weep with your friend, to hold each other, and not have it be accused of being sexual. I remember a few years ago, usually around this time in the summer, I'd go back to LA and visit with family and friends. And I remember one night I was staying over a friend's house, and we were just chatting, just talking. And I was going through some difficult period in my life, and just decided to open up and share all the stuff that I was struggling with and dealing with at the time. And these were things that I wouldn't just tell anybody, right? But those that I trust. And I remember starting to tear up. Usually I would kind of, do that and just kind of like fight the tears. And I'm not tearing up now. I just have something in my eye. But I started tearing up, and there was a second where I was going to fight it and just be like, I don't want to cry right now. And then something else came over me and said, why not? This is a buddy that you trust. You guys are close. You've known each other for almost 20 years. Why not? And he told me later on that meant a lot to him, because I was a real person. That him being able to cry with, he didn't cry, but he was there being with me in my time of downness, that it was so meaningful to him. And I look at it from his point of view, and I think to myself, how many times has someone been with me, and I've been on the other side, where they've opened up to me and even cried about some of the issues that they were dealing with, and how it was meaningful to me as well. It's okay for us men to show emotion, to show affection, and to pursue intimacy with other men. I should suggest 3 ways of developing intimacy in our friendships. Number 1 is, don't be afraid to open up to your friends. This is not everybody. There's some people who just give their life story to every single person they get in contact with, right? This is not what we're talking about. With those friends that you trust, maybe 1 or 2, maybe 3 people, 3 bros that you trust, that you know will hold your whatever you say with gravity and take it seriously. It is not to be afraid to open up. The second is, express affection with your friends. If you're not comfortable with it initially, if you add bro or man afterwards, it makes it a little bit more manly or manlier, okay? So, instead of saying I love you, you could say love you, bro. That makes it a little bit more acceptable, right? Just a little tip, just a little hint. Or you say, man, love you, man, But getting in the habit of saying that. I had a small group leader when I first came to Canada, and this guy he was a giant. He was like 6'4", 6'5", and just a big teddy bear kind of person. Big guy. He was very affectionate. Oh, this is not good. He's a big guy, but he was very affectionate. He was affectionate with his children, but even with me, he, give these bear hugs like, love you, man. You always said, love you, man. Love you, bro. Love you. And I took something from that. It's not that we want to throw these words around, but to our friends, to our brothers, to our family members, those who are close to us, to show affection shouldn't be considered a feminine thing. It should just be considered a Christian thing, right? All of us. And then the third way of developing intimacy is to listen well, learning to listen well. A lot of us want to say our piece. We don't listen, but we wait for the other person to stop talking so we can say whatever we have to say. A lot of us operate in our conversations like that, right? But what if we changed our mentality with our friend, we listen to them and engage and interact with what they say, to listen well. So number 1 is intimacy. First goal of developing close friendship. Number 2 is commitment. Commitment. So going back, verse 2, 1 Samuel 18, verse 2, it says, "From that day, Saul kept David with him and did not let him return home to his family." This was positive, because David got to live in the king's palace and eat the king's food and hang out in the king's quarters, just enjoy all the benefits of living in the king's palace. So this was a good thing at this time. Saul did not get jealous of David right now. He let him return to his own family, and Jonathan made a covenant with David because he loved him as himself. Jonathan made a covenant with David. Literally, it says Jonathan cut to David a covenant. Jonathan cut a covenant with David. This is a Hebrew idiom. Cutting a covenant is to make a covenant. One commentator says that it has a picture of cutting an animal, which was not uncommon, and it's basically saying, if I am unfaithful to my word in this covenant, may I end up in pieces like this animal. It's kind of the word picture that is given here when you're cutting a covenant. And the commitment is shown in future passages, chapter 20 and so on, where Jonathan was committed to David as his friend, even above his own father. He knew that his father was once, in the eyes of God, great, but as Saul continued to be king, he fell and became evil, and Jonathan saw that in his father, and his commitment was to David. He made a covenant with him. Now, there's a difference between a covenant and a contract. Contract is legal. Covenant is not legal. From an organization called Up Council, there are some differences between contract and covenant. Here's some fundamental differences. While a contract is legally binding, a covenant is a spiritual agreement. This is just according to the legal world. Contract's legally binding, a covenant is a spiritual agreement. Next, a contract is an agreement between parties, while a covenant is a pledge. Next, a contract is an agreement you can break, both parties agree, while a covenant is a perpetual promise. Next, you seal a covenant while you sign a contract. Next, a contract is a mutually beneficial relationship, while a covenant is something you fulfill. A contract exchanges one good for another, while a covenant is giving oneself to the other. Next, you can opt out of a contract, while a covenant is about having the strength to hold up your part of the promise. And finally, one can stop paying in a contract when one party is not fulfilling their part in a deal. However, in a covenant, the party not getting their needs met supports the failing party so that they can meet their obligations. We live in a contract-focused society. We even treat our relationships like contracts. We were talking about this in our small group a little bit last week, but we even some people treat marriage relationships like a contract, rather than what it truly is, a covenant before God and before others, and especially to one another. We also treat our friendships like a contract. Not that we go up to a friend and say, "Hey, can you sign this in order to be my friend?" But in our mentality, right? In our mentality, well, if so-and-so is not fulfilling their part of this assumed contract, non-verbal contract, then we opt out. You know, in college, I remember, I'll never forget this. In college, one of my friends, this is one of my best friends. We hung out together all the time. We had a group of friends, but I was very close to him, and he would convince me to skip class to go to the music store so we can play guitars that we couldn't afford. And that's true. He would convince me, I wanted to go to class. So I would skip class sometimes. Kids, I don't recommend skipping class, okay? Listen. Just had to clear that up. But anyway, but we were close. We played video games, and I'd be late to class because I'd be playing like arcade games. They had these arcade games in the student union building and stuff like that. We were really close. But I remember one time it was during missions conference, and I forget exactly why. I just remember that I was upset with him, and I was immature, and I was just like, screw that guy. And I gave him the silent treatment, and I just avoided him the rest of the week. Maybe it was Monday or Tuesday, I got mad at him. And the rest of the week, I just avoided him. I would see him kind of come across, and I would just like walk in the other direction really fast, or just avoid all week. And I was pretty successful. And when I was in college, I would stay in the dorms during the week, Monday through Friday, or Sunday night through Friday. And then on the weekend, I would go home to be involved in church and eat my mom's home cooking, obviously, and things like that. And so Friday night, someone either my mom or dad would come pick me up from school. It was only 30 minutes away, and drive us home. And I remember Friday night pulling up to our home, and I see Mark's car. And I was like, oh, what is he doing here? I haven't seen him all week because I was avoiding him. And I kind of played it cool. I was like, hey, what's up, man? What are you doing here? And he's like, hey, can we talk? So I was like, yeah, sure, yeah. Okay, whatever. And so we went to a restaurant, and he just apologized. He's like, I don't know what I did to offend you and stuff. And I will never forget that because that meant so much. And I played it off like, oh man, it's all good, no worries. I've just been busy all week, making excuses and things like that. And I actually felt shameful for acting like a child by just avoiding him like that. But I remember that distinctly. I will never forget that. That's the commitment. That's the kind of commitment that we don't have in our culture that we need to have. Now, this doesn't mean we commit ourselves to every single person, every single friend. There are different levels of friendship. We'll talk about this more later on. Right? I'm not going to commit myself equally to everybody I consider a friend. There are some friends who are more of acquaintances that you don't have a history with necessarily, and there are some friends where you've known for a long time and you've developed a history with that person. Those are the people, if they make one mistake, there's a commitment there. Let's try to work it out. If someone wrongs another, if you've been wronged, or if you wronged the other friend, that there's a commitment to say, hey, you know what, we have enough history here, let's work it out. I'm sure David and Jonathan had their issues as well. Maybe it's not recorded, but they've had issues. I'm sure they worked it out, talked it through. And that is the kind of commitment that we need. And so it begins with understanding who we choose as friends, who we choose to let into our lives, who we choose to invest our time and energy, knowing that they're not perfect, they'll make mistakes, but we remain committed to that person. And the third goal to strive for, first is intimacy, second is commitment, third is humility. 1 Samuel 18, verse 4, it says, Jonathan took off the robe he was wearing and gave it to David, along with his tunic and even his sword, his bow, and his belt. Took off his robe, gave his robe, tunic, his belt, his bow to David. Now, in our culture, that's probably strange to do. Don't do that. Just take off my shirt, and give it to somebody. That's a weird thing to do. But in ancient Near Eastern culture, the clothes represent the person. I mean, in our culture too, but more so in ancient Near East culture. It signified who you were and the status or position that you had at that time. So when Jonathan gives David his clothes, and his tools. There was a symbol of relinquishing their own status, his own status, and giving it to David. It was an act of humility, basically. It's not that David needed these clothes. It's not that he needed a donation of any sort. But all these things were status symbols that Jonathan gave to David so that David would be respected. It was a sign of respect and humility. We can do this in different ways in our culture. You know, when I was a youth pastor, I had a co-youth pastor. He led the junior high group. I led the high school group. And he would stand up before the students, and he would, for example, like at retreats, he would say, you know, Pastor Dave has put in so much work, without even thinking of himself. We did about the same amount of work for this retreat. He'd always praise me in front of others. And at first I felt kind of weird about it. But it was a sign for him. He didn't think about himself, but he thought about his friend. All these stories make me sound like a horrible friend, and I just have good friends before me, but I'm a horrible friend. Probably not far off from that. Right? But Jonathan did the same thing. That is the same thing. Instead of thinking about oneself, Jonathan loved David as himself. And so he lifts David up. He praises him. He gives him his own status at the time. And again, we don't do this with every friend, but with those who are close to us. Humility with our friends. That can look like so many different things, where we sacrifice our own comforts, we sacrifice our own status for the benefit of our friend. So intimacy, commitment, and humility. Again, I just want to emphasize that this shows that we do need to be selective in who we bring in to our inner circle, so to speak. Not in an elitist way, but if we want to pursue intimacy with somebody else, we better trust them. If we want to be committed, if we're committing ourselves to somebody, we better trust them. And if we are going to be humble before that person and lift them up, we better trust them. Some of us may be dealing with trust issues. Maybe we've been burnt before. Maybe we've been burnt twice, 3 times, 4 times, many times. We've been hurt by others. And that's something that we'll need to work through, because not everybody will hurt you. It's just a matter of finding the right type of people. Jonathan found David. David was an upright, upstanding guy. Was he perfect? No. We know he made a lot of mistakes. Right? He did some horrible things. And later in life, he did probably 2 of the most horrible things possible. So David wasn't perfect, but he was good. He was a good guy. And Jonathan saw that. And he chose David over his own father because he saw that in David. And you notice it wasn't forced. It happened naturally. And so for men, I give you encouragement not to be afraid of a bromance. Okay, don't go, hey, you want to have a bromance? Not that any of you would do that, but it's not necessary to use that word, but let's not be so afraid to pursue intimacy and commitment to another man, because this is how God uses other people in our lives to conform more and more to his image. You know, I have grown more in my spirituality from my friendships than I have in sitting in church on a Sunday morning. Sitting in church on Sunday morning is fine. It's nice. It's necessary. But real growth for me has come from deep friendships with others who are pursuing the same thing as I am, right? Becoming more and more like Christ. And they're the ones that know me the best, and they're the ones that can say, bro, what are you doing? What are you doing, man? Come on, let's get back on it. Okay? Or they're the ones that are going to weep with me when I'm in pain. They're the ones that are going to walk with me and to be Christ. And so maybe you're sitting here and you may be thinking, well, I don't have a friendship like that. I don't have a bro like that. And I would say it's never too late. It's never too late. This is why church exists, right? For friendships, pretty much. And it doesn't mean that you have to go from 0 to 100 right away. But in developing friendships means talking, hanging out, having conversations, little by little, opening up, little by little, and seeing if the other person opens up as well and is able to connect on the same way. For the women, I'll give this encouragement. If you're married, encourage your husband to pursue a bromance, pursue a brotherly friendship. Encourage him, if you know who that other friend is, encourage him to keep hanging out with his bro. I'm thankful, I'm not married, but I have married friends, and their wives always encourage them, at least most of them are encouraging to hang out with me, and I appreciate that. Because it gives an opportunity for the husband to spend time with someone who is not their spouse and to gain further insight to mature apart from that. And also, women, I would say, if there's any lack, you can pursue this too. But above all of us, may we surround ourselves with godly friends who we trust, develop intimacy, commitment, and humility, so that we can all together as one grow in righteousness and holiness. Let's pray.